Okay, so now I'm going to talk about e-invoicing from a user perspective. When looking at these infographics, which you all have in your folder, it kind of sums up what I was planning to talk about. So I don't know if we should just, but it's very, very good. But just to give us a short background to why we're talking about this at all currently, the European directive on e-invoicing and why it came about. One thing that we've seen, and Christian mentioned this also, we had several different standards being used around Europe. Some early adopters have already started in public sector with some more modern e-invoicing standards, but there were also a lot of industries, automotive industry, for example, the retail industry, who had within their industries already been working with e-invoicing for quite a long time. So we had actually hundreds of different types of solutions or standards around Europe. Also, even though many of these were using international standards, they were using them in their own way. So again, in the automotive industry, they have their way of working with these standards. And in Denmark, they had another way of doing it. So there was a lack of contextualized, of a normative contextualized standard. Meaning that's something that we can all use together in Europe. And then there were different approaches and ambitions, and all of that led to the creation of this directive, which sets the minimum requirements on the public sector to be able to receive e-invoices. And one important part says that the benefits of electronic invoicing are maximized when the generation, sending, transmission, reception, and processing of an invoice can be fully automated. And a mere image file should not be considered to be an electronic invoice in the purpose of this directive. So these are two statements that I'm going to hang on to during this presentation. Furthermore, on the minimum requirements, it says that receipt and processing of electronic invoices under Article 7 in the directive, that the member states shall ensure that the contracting authorities and entities can receive and process electronic invoices, okay, which comply to a European standard and following any of the syntaxes on a specific list. So this is what can be read from the directive. So all the public entities must be able to receive and process invoices. That's number one. They must receive invoices that following a specific standard. But also this standard can take different forms using different syntaxes. And the syntaxes are mentioned on a specific list. So this is something that I will talk more about during the upcoming hour or so. But this is highly relevant for you because this is, of course, the requirement on you that you should be able to receive according to this standard. So some important aspects. We have the seller solution and the buyer solution. The invoice is to be exchanged in a structured format. We had this standard, which we sometimes refer to as the semantic standard or the norm. It contains all the business terms in an invoice, such as the invoice number, the issue date, the price of the product name, the VAT breakdown. Everything you see on a paper invoice, every element on a paper invoice is business terms defined in this European standard. So but it's also the rules saying that, for example, if the invoice has VAT in it, the supplier must have a VAT number mentioned in the invoice. So it's both the information and how it hangs together. And also I mentioned the list of different formats or syntaxes. So these business terms can take a technical form when being sent using any of these file formats. So people then immediately ask, why more than one? What's the benefit of more than one? That's a good question. Should be asked over and over again, I think. But the reason behind it was that there was an expectation for the first to find a consensus in Europe on a single format, because there are many around. And there was an expectation that some suppliers are using one format already and some other suppliers are using another, and they could continue with that as long as they're following this semantic part. So it ended up being only 2 syntaxes, and they are very alike, so it's not that complicated in a sense. So what does the standard actually contain and what does it address? I'm trying to use this way of describing it. On the right side, we have the supplier, and here we have the customer, and they have their IT solutions. The supplier, perhaps he has his ERP system, and the customer has some kind of workflow system for working with their invoices and an accounting system. And on the left side, we should represent then the standard, the European norm and the syntaxes. And of course, the standard is describing what is being exchanged, what is the content of an invoice. It also then has, of course, relevance on user interfaces and how is the invoice presented to the user. And this has also relevance to you as end users, because elements within the invoice is now standardized. So you will find the actual definitions of many of the business terms which are often defined bilaterally or within trading contracts. So it's important to align things, for example, like if you have the delivery date of goods. All right, is it when the goods were shipped from the supplier or when it was received to the customer? Things like these elements are in the standard. So, and it has relevance also on your way of doing business. And then there are some parts in the standard which relates to, for example, how do you do crediting, or when working with orders or dispatch advices. That has relevance to the systems. The technical formats has relevance, of course, when it comes to the actual exchange. But it also has some consequences on archiving, and even when you might, as a receiver, you might sometimes convert or translate the incoming format into your ERP systems format, and that has then relevance. However, e-delivery, or the actual transportation of the e-invoices, is not part of the European standard. And the directive doesn't specifically say anything about how the invoice is to be sent. So you could, if you really want to be problematic, you could say that, yes, we want invoices to be sent on USB sticks delivered to our postal address on Mondays. Because the directive doesn't say anything about it. Of course, without specific standard on how to exchange the invoice, there will be no exchanged invoices. And if every receiver defines their own way. So therefore, the e-delivery aspects are super important. And for Ireland, you have a clear policy when it comes to PEPL. And PEPL provides this layer, how to interconnect. And many other countries are going the same way. Some countries have not come to this realization yet, that they have to provide this. They know the directive, they read it, they know there is a standard, but then so they think that they're done. Most other countries have come a bit further, I would say. So just to make everything clear, so invoicing, in the context of the directive, it's formatted in a structured way, so it can be processed efficiently. It's issued, transmitted, and received electronically, and that rules out paper invoices which are scanned by the receiver but managed in an electronic way. So you might have a workflow system today, and as a user, you're using a system, you get a notification on email that you have an invoice to assess and approve. You do it within your ERP system perhaps. That is not e-invoicing, because it wasn't structured when it was issued and sent. The same goes for PDF invoices, and this is a common misunderstanding that, we do all e-invoicing already. We get many electronic invoices by getting PDFs emailed to us. That is not e-invoicing in the context of the directive. So it has to be structured. So, looking at it from a user perspective, why do we do this? There are many arguments for working with e-invoicing. You get quicker payments, better quality. It's very good for the environment. The numbers are quite impressive. The amount of paper in the postal services, invoices is a big part of what they are carrying around. It saves times, the security is better. So from a supplier perspective, the reason why you're doing it, sometimes because your customer requires it or it's required by law, and it's cost saving. So, and these are just a few of the benefits with e-invoicing. One thing that we've seen is also when you have the capability to send e-invoices, you have perhaps the systems in place. Then the next step to start working with full e-procurement with orders, dispatch advices, and price lists and catalogs. Then that step is much smaller, so you can easily start to work with full e-procurement and not only the e-invoicing part. Even though the e-invoice is the last step in that process, it's kind of awkward to start there. You think that it's better to start with the orders, but now now we have the directive, and this will pave the way, I think, for the rest. So looking at what capabilities are necessary for the suppliers and for the customers. Again, we see this picture where we have the supplier up there, and we have the customer, and we have their different systems. And now the suppliers, and I've seen many, particularly municipalities in Sweden, they're very afraid that they will upset their SMEs, their local, regional companies, when they start to mandate e-invoicing, and they say, but what if they can't? The fact is that there are so many options available, and many of them are much cheaper than what they are currently doing with paper. So that isn't a big concern in reality, but it's a concern that often comes up. But what do they do when they generate the invoices? And I give you some examples of these what the capabilities they might have. Either if they are like a bigger supplier, they're probably going to create their invoices directly in their ERP system, or in their invoicing system. So they will directly generate these electronic invoices. For smaller ones, web portals are very popular. So perhaps, I don't know if you have considered that as in the Irish infrastructure or strategy, but if the public sector have like a web portal where small suppliers can enter the invoice manually. There are both these type of web portals provided by the customer, but there are also web portals available in Peppol that any supplier can just become customer at, or even some are free, so you can issue invoices in these web portals. But then you're keying in your invoice in a web user interface, so it's like a double step. You have to issue it first in your own system, and then you have to re-enter it in a web portal. So it's just for small volumes. Then we have some service providers who have something called print to capture, which is a quite neat technology, where you install a software on your computer, and when you are printing your invoice, you choose to print your invoice to this virtual printer. So it's not a physical printer, it's just a virtual printer, and that virtual printer picks up the printing stream and creates an electronic invoice. So you can continue using your old accounting system or invoicing system, but you just install this virtual printer. So that is also a popular way of creating invoices. So these are examples of what the customers can do. Then we have the aspects of the transmission. And here we also have different approaches in different member states. We often mention the four-corner model, meaning that the buyer and the seller, they can use service providers to take care of the communication. And they can pick their own choice of service provider. And Peppol, which is an e-delivery network, is a four-corner model approach. In Peppol, you have access points, and these access points is your corner. So you as a buyer and as a supplier, you have each an access point to Peppol, and through that you send and receive your documents. Three-corner model is slightly different. That's when the buyer and the seller have to use the same service. This is common in some countries where they set up a central hub where everybody, all the suppliers have to log in and key in their invoice. This can, of course, be, there has some drawbacks on this model when you're forced to use a specific service that someone else is pointing to, instead of using perhaps something that is more convenient for you. Two-corner, peer-to-peer, when you're sending directly between buyer and seller, that's not very, in large scale, that's not very common. So typically, this diagram, I'm going to point here. No, you will not see. Okay, starting from the left side, we have a company. He has created an invoice. That's the document icon there. And he's sending his invoice through his service provider to the receiver, to his customer. This is the four-corner model. Without any specific collaboration agreements, this can be very problematic, because if I choose a service provider in Sweden and I'm going to send an invoice to Ireland, how am I guaranteed that my service provider is collaborating with the Irish service provider? There are hundreds of these in Europe. So this is a major problem in cross-border, but it's even problematic on a national level if it's up to the service providers to themselves decide on who to collaborate with, who to exchange documents with. It's like if you were using telephones in your mobile phone, and depending on who your carrier is, you can only call some, not everybody, because the carriers, they decide. Now, we don't like this Nordic carrier, so we exclude them from our telephone network. That is what has happened in looking back, both on purpose in some cases, but also just by the fact that it takes a lot of time for these service providers to build up all of these collaboration agreements with everybody else. So it's a maintenance problem in that. Peppol, which we will hear more about later, solves this issue. And that's what's revolutionizing. That's why Peppol is a revolution in e-invoicing, because it has the automatic lookup facility, so you don't have to have any prior configuration, and also it has a legal framework for the service providers, so they go into a contract with Peppol, and by that they can communicate with everybody within the Peppol network. So you don't have to know everybody out there. You just know that you have been certified as a certified access point, and when you're a certified access point, you can communicate with everybody else. So this is something that when you are going to build your capability for living up to the directive, to make sure that you have a certified access point somehow connected to your systems. Then, for the reception of the invoice, we, of course, then have to have this access point that I was talking about if you connect it to a four-corner e-delivery network. Also, after the invoice has been received, there needs to be functionality to archive and sometimes transform that invoice into the format that your systems can support. Some kind of workflow system is necessary, I would say, for efficient use of electronic invoicing. If you're working with scanning today, it's probably the same thing in many ways. Often the same systems who is providing scanning workflow functionality also have e-invoicing workflow So when an invoice is received, it's being automatically handed to the correct person in the organization for assessment and approval. And so that is for the reception. And for the processing, I would say that there are typically two ways to handle the reception of the invoice in the workflow. Either you have a centralized approach, so all invoices just being sent to the finance department, for example. You have a group of people who look at all the invoices and then sending them out to the managers or to the persons in the organization for approval. That is like the spider in the web approach, so all invoices comes to the same place. You can also work with references. In a paper invoice, you often have your reference field. With that reference, you can get the invoice. When it's being received, it's being handed over automatically by the workflow system to the person who it relates to. So I did the purchase. I'm the first one to see the invoice when it's being received. So I can say, yes, I did this purchase, and my manager can approve the invoice. So that is the more decentralized handling, which is, of course, more efficient. And looking at how that could work, this arrow here, this line, what it represents is that the invoice number one here, the invoice is being sent, it's received by my service provider. That's point number 2. The invoice is automatically handed over to my workflow, where the information about the supplier is verified. So is this a proper supplier? Do we know him? Is the account numbers correct? And do we have a contract and all of that? If everything is okay, the invoice is handed over to the person who did the purchase based on this reference, who says it's okay and it's being approved. And after that, normally some of the information is handed over to the accounting system for booking into accounts and for the payment to be initiated. So this is a typical, flow of the activities when you have received a document. So the other approach is when you have the straight-through invoice processing, meaning that no human beings are involved in the approval process of each individual invoice. So instead, you have some kind of registry where you can register things like phone subscriptions or electricity contracts, or I don't know the English word for it. And then when the invoice comes, it can be automatically tested against given parameters. So you're saying that for phone bills, it has to be not more than 40 euros a month. And it has to be perhaps at least 5 euros a month. In that way, you will make sure that any invoice that's above these numbers will be handled manually, but also if it's below a specific number, and we've seen this is a business rule, a validation rule that's often implemented, what I've seen in Sweden, and what they do is that they find out that, okay, this invoice isn't used. This telephone isn't used. We are paying perhaps for the fixed fee, but no one is using it, so we can take it out. So and hundreds of subscriptions are detected that way because you have straight-through processing. And similarly, here we have the same approach where after the supplier has been verified, the invoice is handed over to some kind of logic, where a computer software is just evaluating if the amounts are correct. And in that case, or if there is an electronic order perhaps being registered before, then if it matches, then the invoice is automatically accepted. So that was the two typical processes for the receivers to work with, either references or the straight-through processing. Sorry, I take some water. And looking again, just more or less like a summary, what happens when you receive an invoice? We have here the issuer, what the issuer does, and here what the receiver does. And the first thing, of course, is that the invoice is issued by the supplier, is issued, and it's being exported into some electronic format. This is the typical process. This format is now in my original syntax. It could be, if I'm using SAP, it might be SAP's internal format for how they export format. It's not normally conformant to the European standard. Or I would say it's very, very seldom that the ERP systems have the European standard as their native export format. So what's necessary is often to translate this into the exchange format. And here I say that you probably can't see, but it's the agreed exchange format, the European standard. Sometimes, if it could be in the future that the ERP system does this natively, then then the supplier don't have to think about this step. After that, normally the supplier validates that the invoice is correct, is compliant to the European standard, and there are very, very nice technologies available now to actually test every single invoice being submitted, that it follows all the mandatory rules of the standard. And by that, we can have much, much higher quality than we are used to before. For all the amounts are correctly summed up, all the references, all the codes, values, everything is correct. So this is a quality step to validate. And particularly, you can find out what's wrong before you hand it over to the receiver and let them find out that something is wrong. It's a costly process. So after you validated the invoice, you somehow, and this is normally taking place in the access points of the sending system, you look up the address of the receiver, so the technical address, where to actually submit the invoice. And in the case of Peppol, this is taken care of by the Peppol infrastructure, this addressing mechanism. So there is a registry functionality in Peppol. So a query is sent to the network, what's the technical address for where I should send this invoice? And back comes the technical address so that the issuing system can submit the invoice to the receiver. And this happens for every invoice, so it's very dynamic in that sense. I highlighted the blue ones. These are the steps that normally are carried out by a service provider or a third party. It could be built into the ERP system, but often it's someone else outside, so you have to have collaboration between different actors. On the receiver side, we have now received the document in the European norm format, and it's being validated. Does it follow all the rules? We don't want to notice that something is wrong with the invoice when it's in our workflow. We want to verify all of that before we start importing it into our systems. The same question here. Do I need to transform this invoice into my own internal in-house format? If not, then I have my invoice in my preferred format. But if I need to transform, I'll do that. And also I need to consider, do I need to archive the original document? Because I moved all the data elements or the information in the invoice to a new representation, but do I need then to save the original one? That is a decision that is for public entities normally is a yes, because you want to make sure that you archive everything that you receive. And you have then, in any case, the invoice in your in-house format, which your ERP system or your workflow system can import, and the process of assessing and approving the invoice starts. So this is a high level or fairly detailed flow of the activities involved when sending and receiving invoices. Normally, this is not how the end user sees it. From a user perspective, I'm issuing my invoice in my invoicing system. I push the send button, and then these service providers or softwares takes care of all these steps. So you don't see this in real life, but from a software perspective, these are the steps involved. And that means that for this to work, for these to be able to, the issuers to collaborate with the receivers, there must be alignment in standards and capabilities. So what is the exchange format? Now we have the European norm. That helps a lot, of course. How do we find each other? In PEPL, we have the registry of receivers, so I can look that up automatically. That helps also a lot. I don't have to agree on all these technical aspects. PEPL takes care of that. So the transmission technology is also being taken care of by PEPL. How to do the actual sending of the invoice and the acknowledgement that it was received correctly, and security, that the invoice was signed on the wire and nothing happened to it while it was transmitted. And again, the acknowledgement, reliability in the process. So one thing, a takeaway is that for those countries who have not decided yet to go on to use PEPL, they have to take care of all these questions themselves in a way that hopefully will be interoperable, but it will be hard for many of them, I think. When using PEPL, this is a package that's being provided by PEPL, so it's much easier for those countries. Christian talked about early adopters of e-invoicing, and just like a summary from my point of view, the success factors are that those countries who have been successful have policy on standard for format and content. That's so a clear, for public sector, to have someone with one voice saying, use this standard. Also, likewise, a policy on how to exchange the transmission of the invoice. That is also something that should be a clear message from a central part of the country, saying this is how you should do it, so that not everybody needs to go through this process and learning process themselves and decide on these questions. Also, if you just leave it to the market to decide, you might end up in different types of solutions that cannot connect with each other. So if a supplier who is a supplier to Dublin town is using one software, but when he's going to send invoices to a government authority, suddenly he has to use another software because they have come to different conclusions on how to solve this. So that is very important, to have a clear policy on standard and transmission. And then also to have support available for the implementers, both for you as end users when you have questions, but also for the service providers and the software providers, so that they can implement this with good quality. So they're not just left alone and coming to their own conclusions, so to help. Tools that helps conformance testing is also very useful, and to have legal requirements. I understand that in Ireland, the approach is now to implement the directive as is, meaning that you as public entities must be able to receive invoices. That's it. Correct, yeah. Some other countries, like Sweden and Denmark, has the more strict implementation, which means that the customer or the suppliers must send the invoices. So it looks perhaps like a small difference, but it's really it's a big change, because we will now jump in Sweden from perhaps 50% electronic invoices up to 100% in a overnight, because it will be illegal to send paper invoices. So that's a very strong incentive. So we have these extreme approaches, either just as is in the directive, or to require everybody to use it. And in between, we have also some countries that say, we implement it as the directive says, but then we also have additional measures, such as it is now required that for all public tenders, electronic invoices will be mandatory. So when you enter a public tender, a public contract, then you have to. So it's not like a overnight requirement. It's more like a soft approach, or it could be a recommendation to have this as a contract statement in your tenders, or in the call for tenders, that the suppliers must send electronic invoices. So there are some ways of going from the more relaxed, that let the suppliers do it if they want, to mandate 100% invoicing. I think that it's not a good idea for you to jump directly on mandating. It's probably a multi-step approach, but in the end, to get all the benefits of electronic invoices, also for the SMEs and companies, it's also for 100%. But when they are ready, and probably it will take a few years for them to get there. You have a roadmap for how to implement electronic invoicing. It's a very good help here, I think, for public entities to get a first assessment of their situation and what they can do. Really useful. Not all countries have it as easy as you, in the sense that you have decided on a policy on using PEPL and focus on the European standard. Again, this makes it much more convenient for you. The same goes now in Sweden and many other countries. But yes, things to consider when developing this type of roadmap is, of course, that there is one step, which is the kind of external perspective, the interconnectivity. That is what everybody has to rely on. What standard to use for the invoice, how to send and receive. Those aspects are important to be clear on. You have that here. Then it's a little bit more complicated for the suppliers, because their situation is more diverse. They have different ERP systems, they have different maturity levels. Some are already doing e-invoicing, some have never heard of it. So it's really need to have multi-measure approach on how to help them to build their capability. But it helps them a lot if you have clear policies. For example, when it comes to these references, so that they have the same type of way of identifying themselves, or how to refer to customers and so on. Any supporting tools are always welcome, open source or freely available tools. And for the customers, things that I see that you have also clearly stated here, depending on if you have a shared service center, or if you have if you're not, then you have come to different conclusions. Should every public entity have to go out to tender for these types of systems necessary, or should there be framework contracts available? In Sweden, we have provide all the public sector with framework contracts for the capability of receiving in PEPL, and also for the workflow system. So it's now being finalized. So there are two major providers of that functionality. And then again, how should we get as much as possible out of e-invoicing? Should we mandate it, or should we do some halfway approach with recommendation on how to onboard suppliers, perhaps through contracts or other ways? And also the support tools or support functionality, so that the end users have someone to turn to when they have questions on the standard, or if they have, because it will happen that the supplier has one understanding of how the invoice should be, and the receiver has another, and how to mediate or to help them to come to working solutions. So these are things that I think is important to take into account when rolling out e-invoicing in a country. And I see that Ireland has come very long in this sense. So with that, I'm done with this part of the agenda.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much.